Mafia boss was about to walk away until he saw her. Theo Graves was about to leave when the cab screeched up and she stumbled out covered in mud, dress torn, blood trickling down her face. He'd seen plenty of messes in his line of work, but this woman wasn't drunk or careless. She was terrified. Her eyes locked on his for half a second before darting back to the street, scanning like prey that knew the predator was close. Then he saw them. The bruises on her wrists, dark and fresh, finger-shaped. She wasn't late to their blind date. She was running for her life. If you want to see how this impossible night, you won't want to miss what happens next.
The woman tried to wave him off, her voice coming out in broken gasps as she leaned against the parked car. "I'm sorry. This was a mistake. I shouldn't have." But Theo didn't move. He'd built an empire on reading people, on knowing when someone was lying and when they were drowning. And this woman was seconds away from going under. Her hands trembled as she tried to smooth down her ruined dress, mud streaking across the ivory fabric that had probably cost more than most people's rent. This wasn't some random woman having a bad night. This was someone who'd gotten dressed up, put on expensive perfume, and then ended up crawling through hell to get here. A black SUV rolled past them slowly, its tinted windows catching the streetlight. The woman went completely rigid, her breathing shallow and quick like a rabbit that had just spotted the hawk's shadow. Theo's instincts flared. He knew that kind of fear. He'd caused enough times himself to recognize it in someone else. Without asking permission, he took her arm, not rough, but firm enough that she couldn't pull away, and guided her toward the restaurant entrance. "Wait, no, you don't understand," she started, but Theo was already moving. The host at Adriano's took one look at the mud-covered woman and opened his mouth to protest. But Theo's expression stopped him cold. Within seconds, they were being ushered through the main dining room. Past tables where senators sat with casino owners and judges, shared wine with men who owned half the docks. No one looked twice. In Theo's world, you learned quickly not to ask questions. The private room in the back was exactly as he'd requested it. Quiet, secure, with only one entrance he could watch. Ramona collapsed into the leather chair like her legs had finally given up on holding her upright. Her whole body was shaking, and she kept trying to wipe the mud off her arms with trembling hands. But she only managed to smear it worse. Theo poured water from the crystal pitcher on the table and set it in front of her. She stared at it like she'd forgotten what water was for. "Drink," Theo said, his voice low and steady. She obeyed without thinking, her hands wrapped around the glass, so tight he thought it might shatter. He pulled out his phone and texted his usual order to the kitchen, then sat down across from her and waited. Patience was a weapon he'd mastered years ago. Most people couldn't stand silence. They'd fill it with truth, just to make it stop. She finished the water and set the glass down carefully, like she was afraid of breaking something else in her life. "You should leave," she whispered, still not looking at him. "You don't know what you're getting into." Theo leaned back in his chair, studying her. Mid-30s, probably. Well-educated based on the way she spoke. The kind of woman who knew which fork to use at fancy dinners, and how to smile through conversations she hated. But right now, all that polish was stripped away, and what remained was raw survival instinct. "Try me," he said simply. That's when she finally looked up, really looked at him, and he saw the moment recognition clicked in her eyes. She knew what he was. Not the details, maybe, but the shape of it. The expensive suit that fit too perfectly. The way the restaurant staff had moved around him like he was royalty. The cold calculation in his expression that came from making life and death decisions before most people finished their morning coffee. She'd been married to a man who built his career prosecuting people like Theo. She knew a dangerous man when she saw one. "My name is Ramona Castell," she said quietly, and watched his reaction. Theo's expression didn't change, but his mind was already racing. Castell. Julian Castell, the golden boy district attorney who smiled for cameras and gave speeches about protecting families and fighting corruption. The man who'd frozen 3 of Theo's accounts last year and put 2 of his associates behind bars. The man who was so clean, so perfect, so beloved by the public that even Theo's best lawyers couldn't find dirt on him. "Julian Castell's wife," Theo said, not a question. Ramona's laugh was bitter and broken. "For 7 more years, if I survive that long." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away quickly, like she could hide the tears that were threatening to fall. Tonight was supposed to be different. "My friend Celeste, your sister, she set this up without telling me. Said I needed to meet someone who could help. But Julian found out." The food arrived then, carried by a server who knew better than to make eye contact. Ramona didn't touch it. She just stared at the door like something was about to crash through it at any second. Theo watched her carefully, piecing together the story she wasn't saying out loud. The bruises, the terror, the desperate flight through mud and darkness. Julian Castell, the man who prosecuted domestic abusers and gave passionate speeches about protecting women, was exactly the kind of monster he claimed to fight. He came home early, Ramona continued, her voice steadier now, like she decided to stop running from the truth. Saw the dress I'd laid out, the makeup on the counter. He grabbed me by the wrists and slammed me against the wall. Told me I wasn't going anywhere, that I belonged to him, that if I ever tried to leave, he'd make sure no one ever believed me. She touched the cut above her eyebrow, unconsciously. When his office called and he went to answer it, I ran. Straight out the back door, through the yard, into the woods behind our house. I crawled through mud and thorns for 20 minutes just to reach the main road. Theo's phone buzzed against the table. A text from Cole, his second in command. Asterisk DA's office just issued a missing person alert. Julian Castell's wife. They're saying she's mentally unstable and dangerous to herself. Every cop in the city is looking for her. Asterisk. He looked at Ramona again, at the mud caking her hair and the blood on her face and the bruises shaped like her husband's fingers. Then he looked at his phone, at the alert that was already turning her into the villain in her own story. Julian was already moving, already spinning the narrative, already making sure that when they found her, no one would believe a word she said. Theo slid his phone back into his pocket and made a choice that would change everything. You're not going back there. Ramona's eyes went wide. You don't understand. He'll destroy you. He has judges, cops, prosecutors. Everyone who matters is in his pocket. And if he finds out I'm with you, he'll use it to bury us both. Let him try. Theo's smile was cold and dangerous, the kind that had made grown men confess secrets just to make it stop. He'd been waiting years for Julian Castell to slip up, to show the world what he really was beneath all that polish and charm. And now his own wife had just handed Theo the opening he needed. Within 30 minutes, Theo had a car waiting in the underground garage and a clean set of clothes delivered to the private room. Ramon had changed in the attached bathroom while he made calls, his voice low and controlled as he repositioned pieces on a chessboard only he could see. When she emerged, the mud was gone but the fear remained, etched into every line of her face. The simple black dress and jacket made her look like someone attending a funeral. Maybe she was. The drive through the city was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional burst of police sirens in the distance. Ramona sat pressed against the passenger door, watching the streets blur past like she was memorizing her last moments of freedom. Theo's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since they left the restaurant. Text after text from associates, warning him that the DA's office was putting pressure on everyone, that patrol cars were stopping vehicles at random, that Julian Castell was apart. Theo pulled up the live feed on his phone and handed it to Ramona without a word. She took it with shaking hands and watched her husband's performance. Julian stood on the steps of their home, surrounded by cameras and concerned neighbors, his face a perfect mask of anguish. My wife Ramona has been struggling, he said, his voice breaking at exactly the right moment. She's been off her medication for weeks, and I've been trying to get her the help she needs. If anyone has seen her, please, I'm begging you, call the police immediately. She's not in her right mind. She could hurt herself or someone else. Ramona handed the phone back, her expression hollow. He's been planning this for months. Every time I try to talk to my therapist, he was there. Every time I confided in a friend, they'd suddenly stop returning my calls. He's been building this narrative that I'm unstable, that I can't be trusted, that everything I say is a delusion. She looked at Theo with eyes that had seen too much. He's going to win. He always wins. Not this time, Theo said quietly, and pulled into an underground parking structure beneath a high-rise downtown. The building wasn't in his name, purchased through 3 shell companies and a law firm that specialized in making things untraceable. The penthouse took up the entire top floor, with windows that overlooked the city like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Inside, Ramona stood in the middle of the living room like she didn't know what to do with safety. She'd spent so long running that stopping felt dangerous. Theo poured her a drink she didn't touch and waited for the crash he knew was coming. It took another 10 minutes before she finally broke, but when she did, it wasn't tears. It was laughter, bitter and sharp and tinged with madness. Do you know what the worst part is? She said, her voice climbing toward hysteria. I used to think I was smart. I had a master's degree. I spoke 3 languages. I could negotiate contracts and manage portfolios. And I let him convince me I was crazy. I let him make me doubt my own mind until I didn't know what was real anymore. Over the next 2 hours, she told him everything. How Julian had seemed perfect when they first met. Charming, successful, devoted to justice. How the control had started small, suggesting what she should wear because he knew what looked professional. Checking her phone because he worried about her safety. Asking her to stop seeing certain friends because they were bad influences. How it had escalated so gradually she hadn't noticed until she was completely isolated. She told him about the first time Julian had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks. How he'd apologized so sincerely afterward that she'd convinced herself it was an accident. About the night he'd held her head underwater in the bathtub because she questioned one of his cases. About how he'd pulled her up at the last second and told her he loved her while she coughed up water in terror. About the thousand small cruelties that had carved away pieces of her until she barely recognized herself. Theo listened without interrupting, his expression carved from stone, but inside he was calculating. He'd killed men for less than what Julian had done. But this was different. Julian had power that even Theo had to respect. Legal power, public sympathy, an entire system designed to protect men who looked like him and spoke like him and smiled like him. There's evidence, Ramona said suddenly, sitting up straighter. I've been documenting everything for 8 months. Photos of bruises, recordings of his threats, bank statements showing money he's been moving to accounts I'm not supposed to know about. I was going to run, but I needed leverage first. Something to make sure he couldn't just drag me back and lock me away somewhere. Theo leaned forward. Where is it? Safe deposit box. First National downtown. Box 347. She pulled a key from inside her shoe, where she'd apparently hidden it before running. But Julian has people watching the bank. He knew I was planning something. He just didn't know when. Theo's phone rang. Cole's name flashed on the screen. Talk to me. We've got federal agents raiding the warehouse on 5th. Cole said, his voice tight. In the casino downtown. In your lawyer's office. This is Castell, boss. He's using every connection he has to pressure us. Says he's going after RICO charges if we don't cooperate with finding his wife. Theo hung up and looked at Ramona, who'd gone pale. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I've destroyed your life. You didn't destroy anything, Theo said calmly. Julian's been waiting for an excuse to come after me for years. You just gave him the opening he needed. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. But he made a mistake. What mistake? He assumed I'd be stupid enough to let him control the narrative. Theo turned back to her, and for the first time that night, he smiled. I've been waiting for Julian to slip up for years. You didn't ruin anything. You handed me the opening I needed. The next morning, Theo laid out the plan. They'd retrieve the evidence from the safe deposit box while Julian was distracted. Cole would create a false sighting of Ramona on the east side of the city, pulling police resources away from downtown. It was risky, but it was their only shot at getting ahead of Julian's machine. Ramona insisted on coming with them. Theo refused at first, but she wouldn't back down. That box is in my name. You need me to access it, and I'm done hiding. There was steel in her voice now, something hardening after years of being beaten down. He took everything from me. My career, my friends, my dignity. I'm not letting him take my chance to fight back. The false sighting worked perfectly. Within minutes of the anonymous tip, patrol cars flooded the east side. Theo, Cole, and Ramona walked into First National like they owned it, which in a sense Theo did. The manager recognized them immediately and asked no questions when Ramona presented her identification and key. They descended into the vault, past rows of identical steel boxes that held the secrets of the city's wealthy and powerful. Box 347 was near the back. Ramona's hands shook as she turned the key, her breath coming in short gasps. This was it. Everything she'd risked her life to preserve. The proof that Julian Castell was a monster. The box was empty. Ramona made a sound like she'd been punched. She reached inside anyway, her fingers scraping against bare metal, as if the evidence might materialize if she just searched hard enough. No, no. It was here. I put it here myself. I checked it 3 days ago. Cole was already examining the access log. His face went dark. Someone got here first. Julian, Ramona whispered. He found it. He destroyed everything. Not Julian. Cole looked up at Theo, and something passed between them that made Theo's blood run cold. The signature on the access log. It's not Julian's. He turned the clipboard so they could see. The name written in neat, careful script. Celeste Graves. Theo's sister. The woman who'd set up this blind date in the first place. The woman who'd been helping Ramona plan her escape. They raced back to the penthouse, but Theo already knew what they'd find. Celeste was there, sitting on the couch with tears streaming down her face. And next to her, looking perfectly at ease in his tailored suit, was Julian Castell. Hello, Theo, Julian said, his smile warm and friendly, like they were old colleagues meeting for drinks. I think it's time we had a conversation. Theo's hand moved toward his jacket, but Julian raised a finger like he was scolding a child. I wouldn't. There are 3 police units positioned within a 2-block radius, all waiting for my signal. You pull a weapon, and this entire building gets locked down within 90 seconds. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. Let's be civilized about this. Cole moved to stand between Julian and Theo, his expression murderous, but Theo waved him off. He sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving Julian's face. Ramona stood frozen near the door, staring at her husband like he was death itself walking toward her. And maybe he was. Celeste, Theo said quietly, looking at his sister. Explain. She couldn't meet his eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she stared at her hands, twisting them together like she could wring out the guilt. He had photos, she whispered, from 2 years ago. The night things got bad, when he had to clean up my mess. Her voice broke. He said if I didn't help him, he'd release everything. The drugs, the money laundering I witnessed, the people I saw you with. He said he'd destroy both of us. Julian leaned back, completely relaxed. Your sister has been quite helpful these past few months, setting up the blind date, encouraging Ramona to trust you, even accessing that safe deposit box yesterday. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket and held it up to the light. All that evidence Ramona worked so hard to collect. Every photo, every recording, every damning document. It's remarkable, really. My own wife, building a case against me like I was just another criminal. You are a criminal, Ramona said, her voice shaking but firm. You're a monster who hides behind a badge. Julian's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. I'm a man who understands how power works. You never did grasp that, darling. Power isn't about being right. It's about controlling what other people believe is right. He turned back to Theo. Which brings us to you, Mr. Graves. You've been a thorn in my side for far too long. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to make a deal. I don't make deals with men who beat their wives, Theo said flatly. Julian laughed, the sound genuine and warm, like Theo had told an excellent joke. Beat my wife. Is that what she told you? Ramona has a vivid imagination, especially when she's off her medication. The bruises you saw? Self-inflicted. The terror in her eyes? Paranoid delusions. I have 3 psychiatrists who will testify to her mental instability. I have neighbors who've heard her screaming at things that aren't there. I have a paper trail documenting my desperate attempts to get her help. You're lying, Ramona said, but her voice wavered. Theo could see Julian's words burrowing into her, activating years of conditioning that told her she couldn't trust her own reality. Am I? Julian pulled out his phone and played a video. It showed Ramona in their kitchen, screaming at Julian to get away from her, throwing a glass that shattered against the wall. She looked unhinged, dangerous. This was 3 weeks ago. I was simply asking if she'd taken her medication. She attacked me. I have dozens of videos like this. Ramona's face went white. You edited that. I was screaming because you'd locked me in the house for 2 days. You were. You see, Julian spread his hands like he was addressing a jury. Even now, she can't help but invent elaborate fantasies to justify her behavior. It's tragic, really. I love my wife. I just want her to get the help she needs. Theo watched the performance with cold assessment. Julian was good. Better than good. He'd built an entire architecture of lies, so carefully constructed that it would stand up to any scrutiny. And with Celeste's betrayal, he had leverage that could destroy everything Theo had built. Here's my offer, Julian continued. You walk away from Ramona. Right now. My men take her to a private facility where she can receive treatment. You shut down the operations I'm currently investigating. The docks, the casino on 3rd Street, the real estate development in Riverside. Do that. And maybe I forget that you kidnapped my mentally ill wife. Maybe I don't use your sister's testimony to send you to prison for the next 20 years. And if I refuse, Julian's smile turned sharp. Then I destroy everything. Your businesses, your assets, your reputation. I'll have federal investigators so far up your organization that you won't be able to sneeze without violating a dozen laws. Your sister goes to prison as an accessory to every crime she's witnessed. And Ramona. He looked at his wife with something that might have been affection on anyone else, but looked like ownership on him. She'll spend the rest of her life in a psychiatric facility, medicated into compliance, with no one ever believing a word she says. The room went silent. Cole's hand had moved to the gun at his back. Celeste was crying harder now, her whole body shaking with sobs. Ramona stood perfectly still, like a statue of defeat. Julian sat there looking pleased with himself, certain he'd already won. Then Theo laughed. It started quiet, just a low chuckle, but it built into genuine amusement that filled the room. Julian's smile faltered. Cole looked at his boss like he'd lost his mind. Even Ramona was staring at Theo, with confusion replacing some of the fear. Something funny? Julian asked, his voice tight. You think you played me? Theo said, still smiling. You think this was your trap? I know it was my trap. I've been 10 steps ahead of you from the beginning. Theo pulled out his phone and pressed play on an audio file. Julian's voice filled the room, crystal clear. I'm a man who understands how power works. Power isn't about being right. It's about controlling what other people believe is right. The color drained from Julian's face. Keep listening, Theo said calmly. The recording continued, capturing every word Julian had spoken since entering the penthouse. Every confession about manipulating evidence, every admission about gaslighting Ramona, every threat about using his position to destroy innocent people. It was all there, in Julian's own voice, spoken with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won. You've been recording since the second Ramona walked into that restaurant 2 nights ago. Theo continued, his voice deadly quiet now. Every phone call you made, every threat, every word, including the lovely conversation we just had where you admitted to fabricating evidence against your wife, blackmailing my sister, and abusing your position as district attorney. Julian lunged forward, reaching for the phone, but Cole moved faster. Within seconds, Julian was on the floor with Cole's knee in his back. The smooth, controlled mask had completely shattered. You can't use that, Julian snarled. It's illegally recorded. It'll never hold up in court. You're right, Theo said, which is why I'm not taking it to court. He made a call, and within seconds, his phone was broadcasting the entire conversation to a number Julian would recognize. I'm sending it to Agent Sarah Chun at the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. You remember her, don't you? The one you couldn't bribe or threaten into backing off our investigation into judicial corruption. The one who's been looking for a crack in your armor for 3 years. Julian's face went from red to white to a sickly gray. You're bluffing. Chen has nothing on me. I'm clean. You were clean, Theo corrected. But thanks to your own ego, you just confessed to multiple felonies. Domestic abuse, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, blackmail, abuse of power. And that's just from the last 10 minutes. He leaned closer. The difference between you and me, Julian, I know what I am. I've never pretended to be anything else. But you built your entire career on being the good guy. When the world finds out what you really are, they're going to tear you apart. The next few hours moved like a nightmare for Julian and a dream for everyone else. Federal agents arrived. Not local cops under Julian's influence, but federal agents from outside the state who'd been building a case against him for months. Turns out, Theo had been feeding them information through Baggate Julian's finances, his cases, his carefully constructed public image. The agents took statements from Ramona, photographed her injuries that were still visible, collected the recordings Theo had been making. Julian tried to spin it, tried to claim Theo had coerced her, but his own voice on the recording destroyed any credibility he had left. When they handcuffed him, he looked at Ramona with pure hatred burning in his eyes. You'll never be free of me, he hissed as they led him toward the door. Never. I'll haunt you from prison. I'll make sure you never sleep peacefully again. Theo stepped between them, his expression colder than winter. She already is free, and if I ever hear that you've so much as spoken her name again, prison will be the least of your concerns. After they took Julian away, the penthouse felt impossibly quiet. Celeste collapsed on the couch, still crying, apologizing over and over. Theo sat next to her and pulled her into a hug. I knew, he said quietly. I suspected weeks ago that Julian had something on you. Why do you think I set up the recording system? Why do you think I pushed him into confessing everything? She looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. You knew, and you didn't tell me. Because you had to believe it was real. If you'd known I was planning a trap, you might have given it away. He wiped a tear from her cheek. You did nothing wrong, Celeste. Julian was always going to lose. It was just a matter of how and when. The weeks that followed Julian's arrest felt like watching an empire crumble in slow motion. Other victims came forward. Women who'd worked in his office and endured his harassment, colleagues he'd blackmailed into silence, defendants whose cases he'd manipulated to boost his conviction rate. The Golden Boy district attorney became the city's most despised, with words like abuse and corruption scrolling beneath his carefully crafted smile. Ramona watched it all from the safety of Theo's penthouse, still processing the reality that she was finally free. The first few days, she'd wake up in a panic, convinced she was back in that house with Julian standing over her. But slowly, the nightmares began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Theo had set her up with his lawyer, a woman named Patricia Keene who specialized in high-stakes divorces and didn't take prisoners. Within a week, they'd filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order. Julian tried to fight it from his jail cell, but his lawyers were abandoning him faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship. Nobody wanted to be associated with a man who'd fooled an entire city while terrorizing his wife behind closed doors. One evening, about 3 weeks after Julian's arrest, Ramona found Theo standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city like he was reading a story written in lights. She'd been staying in the guest room, trying to figure out what came next now that her entire life had been dismantled and rebuilt in the span of a month. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. "You could have walked away that night, protected yourself, avoided all of this." Theo was silent for a long moment, his reflection in the glass showing an expression she rarely saw, something vulnerable beneath the calculated exterior. "My mother was trapped in a marriage like yours," he said finally. "My father was a respected businessman. Everyone loved him. Philanthropist, community leader, the whole performance. But at home, he was something else entirely." Ramona moved closer, listening. "She tried to leave once when I was 12, Theo continued. "Packed bags for me and my sister. Waited until he was at work. But he'd anticipated it. Had people watching the house, tracking her every move. He found us at a bus station 3 towns over." His jaw tightened. "He convinced everyone, the police, our neighbors, even some of our family, that she was having a mental breakdown, that she was dangerous, that he was just trying to protect his children from their unstable mother. What happened to her? She died when I was 15. Official cause was an accidental fall down the stairs." Theo's voice was flat, emotionless, but Ramona could hear the grief underneath. "I knew it wasn't an accident. My sister knew, but we couldn't prove anything. He was too careful, too respected, too connected. And after she died, he got even worse. Started grooming me to take over his business empire, teaching me all the ways a man could control people while wearing a respectable mask. Is that why you became—" Ramona stopped, not sure how to finish the sentence. "A criminal?" Theo smiled without humor. "I became what I am because I realized something after my mother died. The system doesn't protect people like her. It protects men like my father and Julian. Men who know how to manipulate the rules, who understand that power isn't about what's true. It's about what you can make people believe. So I built my own system, one where I didn't have to pretend to be something I wasn't." He turned to face her fully. "When I saw you that night, covered in mud and blood and terror, I saw my mother. And I swore I'd never let another woman suffer that way if I had the power to stop it. That's why I helped you." Ramona felt tears burning in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were something else, gratitude mixed with understanding, mixed with a strange kind of kinship. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me when I couldn't see myself anymore." The trial began 2 months later, and it was a media circus. Julian's defense team tried every tactic they could think of, claiming the recordings were fabricated, suggesting Ramona had seduced Theo into framing an innocent man, even attempting to paint Julian as the real victim. But the evidence was overwhelming. Not just the recordings, but testimony from other victims, financial records showing payoffs and bribes, communications proving he manipulated cases and intimidated witnesses. Ramona had to testify, and Theo sat in the courtroom every single day, a steady presence in the front row. When Julian's lawyer tried to attack her credibility, suggesting she was mentally unstable, just as Julian had always claimed, Ramona didn't break. She looked her husband straight in the eye and told the jury exactly what he'd done to her, her voice strong and clear and unshakable. "He made me believe I was crazy," she said. "He isolated me from everyone I loved, controlled every aspect of my life, and then convinced the world that I was the problem. But I'm not crazy. I'm a survivor, and I refuse to let him make me feel ashamed for surviving." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Julian Castell was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Ramona sat perfectly still, letting the reality sink in. It was over. He couldn't hurt her anymore. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, shouting questions and thrusting microphones in their faces. Theo's security team cleared a path, but before they reached the car, Ramona stopped and turned back to the cameras. "If you're in a situation like mine," she said, her voice carrying over the chaos, "if you're trapped with someone who's convinced you that you're worthless or crazy, or that no one will believe you, please know that you're not alone. There's a way out. It might not be easy, but it's possible. Don't give up." 4 months after the trial, Ramona had moved in her own apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. She started therapy, reconnected with old friends, even begun looking into going back to work. Rebuilding a life from scratch was terrifying, but for the first time in years, she felt like herself again. Not the polished, controlled version Julian had created, but the real Ramona who'd existed before she'd lost herself in someone else's nightmare. One evening, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Theo standing there with flowers. Simple daisies, not the expensive roses Julian used to buy her as apologies after his worst episodes. "We never actually had that blind date," Theo said, a slight smile playing at his lips. Ramona laughed, the sound genuine and free. I should probably warn you. I'm a complete mess right now. Therapy twice a week, court dates for the divorce proceedings, rebuilding my entire life from zero. Not exactly the most stable dating prospect. I don't scare easy, Theo said. They went to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood where nobody knew either of them. No private rooms, no security detail hovering nearby, just two people sharing a meal and discovering who they were outside the crisis that had brought them together. They talked for hours, not about Julian or the trial or the darkness they both lived through, but about other things. Books they'd loved as children, places they wanted to travel, dreams they put on hold while surviving their respective nightmares. What do you want? Theo asked at one point. Now that you can choose anything, what does Ramona Castell want her life to look like? She thought about it, really thought about it. I want to help people like me, she said finally. Women who are trapped and don't know how to get out. I want to create a resource, maybe a foundation, something that can provide the kind of help I needed. Legal support, safe housing, therapy, job training. Everything it takes to actually escape, not just survive. That's a good dream, Theo said quietly. What about you? What does the infamous Theo Graves want? He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I want to be someone my mother would have been proud of. I built my empire on the same principles my father used. Power, control, fear. But watching you fight your way back to yourself these past few months, I've been thinking maybe there's a different way to use power. Maybe I can do something that actually matters. Over the following months, they continued seeing each other, building something real and solid that had nothing to do with trauma bonding or dramatic rescues. It wasn't always easy. Ramona had days where the memories came back hard, and she couldn't stand to be touched. Theo had his own demons to wrestle with, his own guilt about the things he'd done to build his empire. But they learned to navigate it together. Two broken people choosing to heal side by side, rather than alone. A year after that mud-covered blind date, Ramona stood in front of a building downtown, watching workers install a sign above the entrance. The Graves Foundation for Domestic Violence Prevention and Recovery. Theo had funded it entirely, turning one of his properties into a comprehensive support center. Ramona would run it, using everything she learned to help other women find their way out of the darkness. Your mother would be proud, Ramona said, squeezing Theo's hand as they watched the sign go up. So would the woman you used to be, Theo replied. The one who never stopped fighting even when she thought she'd lost everything. That evening, they returned to Adriano's, the restaurant where this had all begun. The same private room, the same table, but everything else was different. Ramona wore a dress she'd chosen herself, her hair styled the way she liked it, her smile genuine and unforced. Theo sat across from her, no longer the dangerous stranger she'd stumbled toward in desperation, but someone who'd become essential to her life in ways she was still discovering. So, Theo said, raising his glass, what do we toast to? Ramona thought about it. About the woman who'd crawled through mud and blood and terror to get here. About the man who'd refused to walk away when anyone else would have. About second chances and new beginnings and the strange, unexpected ways that salvation could arrive. To blind dates, she said, her eyes bright with emotion and possibility. Even the ones that start with mud and end with miracles. They clinked glasses, and in that moment, surrounded by the quiet elegance of a restaurant that had witnessed the beginning of their story, both of them understood something fundamental. Sometimes the worst nights of your life lead directly to the best chapters. Sometimes the person you need isn't the one you expected. It's the one who sees you at your absolute lowest and still refuses to walk away. And sometimes, freedom doesn't look like escape. It looks like choosing to rebuild yourself from the ground up, one brave decision at a time, until the person staring back at you in a mirror is finally, beautifully, undeniably you. The foundation opened its doors 3 months later, and within the first week, they'd helped 7 women leave dangerous situations. Within 6 months, that number had grown to 43. Each woman who walked through those doors saw Ramona, not as a victim, but as proof that survival was possible, that healing was real, that the other side of darkness existed and was worth fighting for. And every time Ramona helped another woman find her strength, she remembered that night, stumbling out of a cab covered in mud, terrified and desperate, meeting the eyes of a stranger who changed everything. She remembered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that the bravest thing you can ever do is refuse to give up on yourself, even when the whole world